I should ask any or all members of the panel to just speak briefly about alternative Arab dramaturgies. That is, given the fact that that our knowledge of the theater of the Arab world and the diasporic theater is increasing all the time, so is the complexity of that world. That is, already to begin with, I know it was certainly a revelation to me to realize how different the theater of, let's say, Algeria and Tunisia is from the theater of Egypt or Iraq or heaven knows, the United Arab Emirates. And then when you add into that mix the theater, the diasporic theater, on one hand, the kind of theater that SHAMIEH and a number of her fellow artists have been creating in New York, and the very different sort of theater that's being now created by refugee Arab groups in Paris and elsewhere. The range of dramaturgies that one might consider is almost overwhelming. And let me just sort of throw that out as a phenomenon, and just ask members of the panel to make whatever observations they would like to make about understanding or relating to this now multiplicity of dramaturgical options that the quote Arab theater now represents for us or offers to us. Okay?
Are we on? Okay. 4 years ago, I was on the jury of the National Theatre Festival and another amateur festival called SAHAR Theatre Festival, and it was fascinating for me to count how many international plays in the Egyptian National Theatre Festival. There were 43 plays, there were 5 Macbeth and 4 Hamlets. And one that was not called a Hamlet because it was a mix between a Hamlet and Abu Zayd al-Hilali, which is an Egyptian saga. So it was really interesting to look at what are the young ones choosing to work with, and they found comfort in the classics. And they still continue to do. There are so many renditions of classical, European Shakespeare, but also classical older versions, old plays, Tawfiq al-Hakim, and very few new plays. And in the jury conversation, we were debating who do we give the new writing award to. And there was only one new play offered, and it was not really worthy of an award. And that was a big conversation. Let's give it the award, but it was really bad writing. Meanwhile, I know a lot of writers who are doing some nice work, interesting work, new work, that are not finding a place on the stage. So it's a fascinating gap between the writing and what the theater makers are choosing to create. That's a first introduction.
Hi, good morning. I'm going to be speaking in the next session, actually using 2 of the plays that we've done in the Theatre Initiative to give examples of 2 different kinds of what we're calling Arab dramaturgies or like approaches to dramaturgy. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but to also make observations about what's happening in Lebanon today. We, contrary to probably what you just said about Egypt, I think it's more in the directorial dramaturgies in Lebanon. The playwriting tradition is really almost non-existing. Like you have like some new voices. I would name Arzi Khadr, Maya Zbib, these are 2 females playwright today in Lebanon that are producing as directors but also as writers, but it's not really something that, that's developing. On the other side, what's really developing at a fast pace, I would say, is different aesthetic choices and styles, you know, a combination of different methods, different ways of producing theater in found spaces, alternative spaces, you know, theater buildings. It's happening at a big scale, and you know, and it's actually what's also interesting is that it's going outside the big city. You know, it's not as much as we would like, but it's also, you know, it's so.
Good morning. I don't even have any pretension of having any great insight, but whatever I do comes from these, besides the work we have done together, these two forthcoming books, one on Saad al-Wanus, which includes his theoretical writings. I think one of the most poignant, important things that he says is that he rejects the sort of side, the line of having a kind of civilizational base on which to build. He absolutely rejects it. The idea that there is some Arab essence. And I think coming from a secular Marxist Eastern Bloc artist, that sort of the prehistory of the present reinforces also that contrary to what many people in, say, North America think, this dynamic did not begin on September 11th, 2001. It antedates it for, by centuries, and I think it is specious in the extreme to suggest that dramaturgy or anything else be seen through the lens of the attack of 9/11. I think that should be right out there. I like the way that Betty dealt with that. Another couple of trends that I think again by doing a history of the last 50 years, picking 5 plays, which is what Nada and I did in the other book, which is forthcoming from Brill, starting with The Dictator by ASSAF Mahfouz. Here you have one of the key elements, I think, in what is going on now, at least, in the Lebanese theater, but I think beyond, is a recognition that writing Fusha is the final residue of Arab nationalism, and it will go. And we've seen this, it's been put to the test by doing King Lear and Blood Wedding in Lebanese vernacular, and the way that people respond to the vernacular on stage. They immediately own it. It speaks to their lives. You may say, oh, it's Aristotelian, it's, but you have a completely different relationship between audience and performer. And in fact, Jawad al-Asadi, who's also in that volume, his Hammam Baghdadi, which you so kindly, did an event when I brought him here to New York when his play was done on Broadway, has rewritten his own play in Iraqi vernacular. His way of updating, he came to the conclusion himself, he's that earlier generation, that it doesn't make sense to have 2 brothers who are a bus driver speaking to each other in Fusha. It's just, why would you do that? And what he does is, it's a very difficult and specific vernacular. I must say, unless you're, Iraqi, it's daunting, it's whatever, but what it feels like is it has a kind of texture. So the final thing I would say then that's evolved from looking at different places, whether it's Ra'id al-Taha's Where Would I Find Someone Like You, Ali, the works of Wanus, of Muhammad al-Marut, is almost everywhere that you look, you see these configurations that go well beyond the so-called Arab world. Whether they're drawing on Ionesco, in the case of Mahfouz, or Muharrij is looking at Othello, is that it was always there, that the Arab theater was always much larger than it's construed in the area of studies. And I think those 2 things you see in the dramaturgy, I think.
This, perfect. this tension that Robert speaks of between the vernacular and the patois, or the classic form, is really and has been for decades a central concern in the Arab theater. It doesn't really have a correspondence in the diasporic theater, although I think there is a similar kind of tension. I'd like to ask Betty to comment on this, between the first thing that Robert spoke about, and that is the Arab essence, or what is it to be Arab? And it seems to me that that right at the heart of the challenge to an Arab American performer is that question. Betty spoke about the desire and the obligation to let people know that Arabs are human beings. They have an existence which is like everybody else's. And I'd like to ask Betty to elaborate a little bit more on the tension between being an Arab American performer and an American performer.
Well, is this on? You know, for me, I create for every play that I get produced, I probably write 3. And it's, so what is interesting to me is that, and we talked about Dalia talking about it, it's the market curates what the world sees. And so I make a very conscious effort to localize and humanize my stories, and by that I mean taking out violence as the core part of the identity of Arabs or Arabness or Arab essence, because I feel like what happens, so I'm in a very strange place, because I know that if I was in Palestine, the kind of work I would create would have a lot more to do with women's rights and a lot of the things that I think need to change within the dialogue of Arab culture. And I know I'm not speaking exactly to your point, but for me, I'm hyper-conscious of what images I'm putting out there of Arabness in an environment like New York, where the only images you see of Arabs are in relation to violence, whether perpetrators of violence or victims of violence. And so what I consciously try to do is just show the humanity and delete that kind of, duality of you're only important and only on an American stage if you're reinforcing how you relate to us, which is either as our victim or as our aggressor. So, I live right in between two worlds. I grew up speaking Arabic as my first language, and I lost it when I went to school. And so I'm a Palestinian in America, but I'm American in Palestine. And so I have a very clear sense of how much these kinds of concepts make no sense, because they don't. And so,
okay.
That's good.
Yeah. Let me open the discussion up to the audience. We'd be happy to hear any thoughts or questions you have to any of us. Frank, will you sort of take charge of this?
Any comment?
Yes.
And I think the microphones are working.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for all these ideas. I would like to come back to what you say about this maybe lack, or like we lack a bridge between writer and makers, theater maker, because this is a very important issue. I would add another comment on it, is that I observe all these years especially in North Africa, and also in some cases for Syrian playwriter, there is kind of a move that the maker, the theater maker, is also the writer. So there is what we call in French écriture scénique. So it's on stage, it's happening during the process. And And many of those artists are making theater from their own materials and their like references from the socio-political situation and so on. And you have Mohamed Al-Attar, you have Leila Suleiman in Egypt, and Wael Ali with Christelle Khudr in Beirut, Mustafa Ben Fadil in Algeria. So you have many of them. Driss Kisides in Morocco, working with what we call Daba theater, so the theater of today. So there is also another way of giving theater to the, like in the process, in the timing. It's like more faster than before with all this taking the play, translating, thinking it would be better in dialect or in Fusha. So there is a kind of need of reacting and bringing their artistic universe back to the audience and the community. So that's what I want to say. Maybe we have to think of this new status position and bridging maybe those.
I have a presentation this afternoon all about the immediate theater that happened, or that continues to happen. So I didn't want to start now because I'm going to have like 15 minutes, only 15 minutes for that. But I myself, I am a theater maker. I write my own work and I direct it, and I haven't released any of my plays to anybody else to work with them yet. And there's a lot of current work that is trying to respond by using that module, and the documentary theater and verbatim theater and different modules of theater of the oppressed. So it's an important module, but I was like taking a step back and looking at why would young Egyptian writers return to classics or stick to Hamlet or Macbeth year after year, not once. So it's just an interesting choice for maybe safety or distance or other political situation.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to just shift the conversation a little bit towards the question of methodology. This is an opportunity to speak to the editorial board of the Arab Stages, and so the questions are very open-ended, but I'm following up on Marvin's introductory remarks about the idea of multiplicity, because the Arab Stages is a remarkable and unique journal in that it proposes a certain kind of epistemology. It creates a form of knowledge that it existed in practice, but there was no journal to aggregate and to theorize and to document and to develop the knowledge of Arab stages. It's a slightly speculative question. If you had endless resources and endless time to think, what would an Arabic epistemology of theatre look like in a journal? What would it, because certainly we have essays and we have reviews and a certain kind of methodology, but I'm thinking about the need to also, in a sense, replicate certain kinds of Western logocentric knowledge that exist within an academy, i.e. a referee journal, but also to think about how we might develop or expand on or develop different forms of knowledge in the journal as well that are perhaps more situated within a local culture and local community. So you could think about what does an Arabic modernity look like? What does an Arabic intellectual community look like? How is that reflected in an academic journal of this kind? So it's a very speculative, open-ended question.
I'll take a stab at it. One thing that might, it's an incredible resource, and I'm just enormously grateful for it. I look at it closely. I read what's in it. I think one thing that's informing our practice, which it's not connected necessarily in a direct way, is the scholarship of people like Marvin, like Ilham Houri Makdisi, like Karim Makdisi, that engages in this reconfiguration, historicizing, through the case of Ibn Daniel and Ibn Daniel being connected to Aristophanes. Ilham Khoury Maktisi looking at radicalism in the Eastern Mediterranean. I was talking to Maximilian yesterday about the relationship between Greece and the Levant in general. This is something that's looked at there. This is exactly what SAHAR is doing in her practice by creating a med lab, as it were. Karim Maktisi, the historian from Rice, also looking at areas of history from the Balkans, from Turkey, from the Levant and Egypt that are contemporaneous, and looking at that history as opposed to area studies kinds of histories, you get different answers that inform practice. So what that reinforces is the extent to which this kind of cultural back and forth that's taking place between Europe and the Arab world has been going on for centuries. In the same way that the world did not, this relationship did not begin on 9/11 in North America. In Europe, the relationship between this part of the world and Europe, obviously Said has given us one optic, one prism for looking at it. I think there are a number of useful other optics for practitioners to look at those relationships and the extent to which that's integrated. And it's not simply a report on current practice, right? What is informing the practice? And obviously it can be social media, obviously it can be technology, it can be a range of things, but perhaps because I'm first and foremost a cultural historian, I think that it has a way of informing our worldview. And as artists, we have a worldview, and sometimes the practice of artists leads us forward, and sometimes the historians and the scholars lead the way, and the artists kind of then take their cue from them. I think, the two in tandem, that's the one thing that I would, sort of say about it. At the same time, what a beautiful resource, and we're so grateful for it.
I will just add on to that. I totally agree with the observations and even more with the impetus that lies behind it. I think that the real challenge that we have, both as citizens of the modern world and as theater practitioners, is to try to work with the knowledge that the world is not centered on Europe. We all grew up with that idea, and we were indoctrinated with that idea, that the theater is a European invention, that the only theater that exists is European. Obviously, this is a restricted view, but the implications then, it's easy to say that, but then the implications of saying, all right, now let's really begin to think about alternatives, to seek out alternatives and consider the implications of it. That's work. Then you really have to learn about other cultures. You have to learn other languages. You have to travel. You have to experience other performative conditions and so on. That's a heavy job. And of course, nobody can do it alone. The world is too big and too complicated. But if as a profession and as a discipline, we in theater commit ourselves to becoming more global, then we can take some important steps. See, I think the biggest problem now is to look at this vastly expanding world of possibilities and say, I can't do that. I can't do all of that. I can't relate to all of that. And then give up and then say, well, all right, I'm comfortable in the English 18th 18th century, that's it. If that's your solution, that's your solution. But I do think that we all ought to really take seriously the challenge to keep pushing out. I mean, as Robert says, it's not just a contemporary, but it's a historical situation. I'll be talking about this a little this afternoon. Again, I can only very strongly underline what Robert says, that the interpenetration and interrelationship of different parts of the globe go back forever. And as I began working on Ibn Daniel, and this is the 13th century, I find that there's all sorts of networks and connections that have really not been looked at seriously at all. That I am totally convinced, again I'll say a little bit more about this afternoon, that Ibn Daniel was profoundly influenced by the contemporary Byzantine theater, about which very little has been studied. Not that there's not more material there, but it's just who is interested in Byzantine theater. And yet, here is a key bridge between what we think of as the East and West. The whole theatrical world along the Silk Route and the theatrical and performance traditions that are connected with that, all through what we in the West call the Middle Ages, has been very, very little looked at by historians. And so the challenge is a vast one, but I think that perhaps the most important thing for our generation is to acknowledge that this challenge exists. To say, this is something that we must turn our attention to it. We can't get away with saying, well, if it's Western Europe, it's okay. Otherwise, to hell with it.
This was just a comment about how your comments about finding comfort in the vernacular reminded me of Brian Doherty's, Theater of War. So I guess there are a lot of, but that is more in terms of using the Greek classics for veterans combating PTSD. But I guess if we want to elaborate on that thought, in terms of parallels in the Arab world, I know we don't want to talk about victims, but more about aspects of Arab communities that are also affected by PTSD because of colonization or war.
I don't know if this will probably speak to what you're saying, but this whole idea of Arab dramaturgies and Arab identity really challenges me personally when I think about it, because I don't wake up every day thinking about my Arab identity. And I think one thing that plays into the equation here is that living, and I speak about myself really, and I only represent myself and just my experience in Lebanon. When you live in a country that you have, nothing in terms of, let's say, civil services, infrastructure, you have a garbage crisis, you have a warlord leading the country, you have the warlords that did the 15 years war are still in office, you have no democratic, you have nothing really. The priorities become these problems, not the problem of, for me personally, how am I represented in the West, or how do people see me, or what do I, So that question of the vernacular, I think this is what we're doing really, and we're only, I loved what Wafa said yesterday about how his purpose really comes, or he discovers his purpose in the process, And I like that idea, and I think this is what's happening with us in a way that, we do King Lear, yes, and people say, why King Lear? We do King Lear in the vernacular, and for some people it's the first, I've heard feedback such as, well, I understood Shakespeare for the first time. But why King Lear? Yes, it's because this crazy king, you know, dissecting the kingdom, throwing everything away. You live this on a daily basis. It's written, 500 plus years ago, but you live this today. Why August Osage County? This is a play that's happening Midwest, Oklahoma. It has nothing to do with Lebanon. It has everything to do with Lebanon, the idea of the family and so all these Lorca, the love story in Lorca, the suppressed desires in Lorca. So, like I don't want to be simplifying the issue too much or philosophizing about it too much, but I think personally as a theater maker, I start from what speaks to me and what I need to say and what I need to understand. This is my, and at this point in my life, in my career, that Arab identity is not surfacing, it's just for some reason.
Well, I just want to say something that I was so moved by Marvin's question of who cares about Byzantine theater. And one of the things that is really, I think, essential to me is it's the question of who cares. Because you have the oral tradition of Shahrazad. You have the most famous storyteller in any iconic context, being a Middle Eastern woman who tells stories to save her life. And if that was highlighted, and what I think the work that you're doing at Arab Stages is so important, because people need to be told what's important. If Byzantine theater was suddenly seen as connected to Shakespeare and everybody wanted to do, the updated Byzantine play or the, thing set in Kosovo, you know what I mean? Like, I think the academics, and what you said, Robert, really mattered to me too about that sometimes it's the academics who lead. It's the academics who tell us what's worth studying, whether it's Byzantine or whether it's the oral tradition of Shahrazad and Hakawatis, which I think is intimately connected to everything in the West, from stand-up comedy to this preponderance of one-person shows. Like when I was coming out of theater school, the idea of somebody doing a one-person show and that being on Broadway was crazy. But now it's a whole new form, and I think it's coming back to that, And if we were to elevate what exists within Arab culture, which is the Hakawati tradition, which is the oral tradition, and say suddenly that's as important as Shakespeare, this idea of stories within stories and stories saving the life of a woman. If that was elevated by academics, we would suddenly, as audience and theater makers, suddenly wake up and be like, oh, I've got to do the new Shahrazad set, and I think it's very important, and that's what's so critical about having venues like Arab Stages to articulate. And for me, as I said, for every play that I do show, I have 3 plays that aren't produced. So I'm very conscious of what actually gets curated by the economics of being an Arab in this city and in this culture. But as an artist, the thing that I'm most excited about is I did a sequel to 12th Night, because I finally feel like I've written enough and I've expressed enough about what it means to be Arab in this context that I can actually go back to what I, at the core, am is somebody who's deeply interested in theater. And so thank you, Arab Stages, for leading the way and saying that this is an important thing worth studying, and what we articulate actually influences what artists make.
Let me put in a plug for Target Margin Theater, which has committed itself to an ongoing Scheherazade project that started last year. I think they're in the 3rd phase of it now, and it's really quite an interesting undertaking. And then let me go on to shift around, as I like to do, and look at things from a different perspective, and that is I'm going to defend Shakespeare in the Arab world. I think it is important to remember 2 or 3 things about European influence and about use of European subjects. King Lear, 12th Night, whatever. Like it or not, the European influence is enormous. I mean, we're living in a post-colonial period, we're aware of this. We might say, oh, it's too bad that Europe has dominated the world in such a way, but it has. I mean, it's a historical fact. It's all very well to say whether you believe it or not, or whether you would be right or not, to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone in India spoke Hindi instead of English? But that's not going to happen. There are facts on the ground. We start with where we are, and where we are is a post-colonial situation. I think that I am not at all uncomfortable with the fact that Hamlet is such a popular character in the Egyptian theater, any more than I was with the fact that Hamlet was a very popular character in the Eastern European theater in the old Soviet days. What was being done then, and Scheherazade is being used the same way, of course, in countries, and alas, there are many of them in the Arab world today, where it is very tricky to do contemporary work. The traditional and generally accepted way to make political statements is by something that indeed can be represented as outside the culture, like Shakespeare. You make your political statements by making Claudia stand for Mubarak or whatever it happens to be. That's a very useful device and is a time-honored device. So that when we talk about, I guess I'm just saying this is a very complicated question. That is to say, like it or not, cultures are hybrid now and are becoming more hybridized all the time. And I think that our responsibility is to be aware of this, conscious of it. We can't fight it. It is just something that happens. But we can view it intelligently, see what is going on, ask what is going on, and indeed look at other possible hybridizations or other possibilities, as this conference suggests, alternative possibilities, alternative dramaturgies. What other things are open to us by getting broader and clearer knowledge of other world cultures? But I don't think we need to deplore the influence of Shakespeare. It is a fact, and there are many parts of it that ought to be celebrated.
Stefan?
Well, I had sort of two questions, and both of them have already been answered. How is it when I am reading about the Arab theater, when I'm listening to you talking, unlike if we were to talk maybe about Indian theater or African theater or whatever, we would be talking a great deal about the idea of post-colonialism and kind of the Western influence and cultural imperialism and as I understand it, much of the modern Arab theater really has developed in the 19th century under the influence of the British and the French and all that. And at this point, it seems to have, and I don't know whether this is a provocative statement, but it seems to be taken for granted that those influences are there. Are there, you as playwrights, theater makers in the Arab world, are they ways as to how to sort of consciously hark back to some Arab and Middle Eastern traditions that go really, really, really far back? And how do you, as theater makers and playwrights, do that? Where do you go? How do you use those kinds of traditions in order to create those kinds of hybrids, really, and those kinds of transcultural products that seem to be part of what we are seeing?
I want to start.
Please.
Piggybacking on what Betty was saying, the production is connected to the funding, and the culture production in general is. In my case, I do independent theater in Egypt, and sometimes I get commissions. The last 2 commissions I had were from the American Cultural Center, part of the embassy. And to produce work in Egypt, they want the work to have something American in it, so that they can justify their mandate of spreading the American culture. As if we don't have American culture. So I need to write proposals that say, I will loosely base my project on this blog. It started initially by them asking me to Arabize The Crucible. And I said, okay, it's an interesting play and it would work whenever we are, wherever we are. And eventually they said it will be very difficult to get the licensing because I have to translate it back to English for the estate of the playwright to give me. It's like, just write a new play, why don't you? I was like, okay. So I created a new play that is based on the idea of a witch trial. And I wanted to make it my own, so I went back to the culture, the songs that people sing in the fields. I went even further back to Isis and the idea of spreading your wings and flying. And I created a new play that is completely Egyptian and new and steeped in the folk tradition of the songs of the fields and the ancient tradition of the pharaohs. But they can legitimize their funding or spending it because it is the story. So that was not successful in future productions, unfortunately, of other plays where they asked me to do something, about women, and I said, can I do something like maybe Cuckoo's Nest, but for women? And no, too controversial. Something else about women, but not that. I proposed something based loosely on stage doors. So it's a play about women in the theater auditioning. And for me to make it interesting, I would have them audition or rehearse something about the revolution, because this is what I want to speak about. And they said, great, I got the funding, I started writing, did my readings with my actors just to get a feel of the play, submitted the play for them. Next morning, 9 a.m., I mean, it means as soon as they reached their office, they said, page 9, 10, and 11 say the word Thawra, revolution. I was like, yeah? Oh, you can't. Like, what do you mean? I wrote a proposal about a play that people are rehearsing for something I call Opera Tahrir. It's a dream of mine to do a musical about Tahrir Square. And they said, oh, but you can't mention the revolution. It would not work because we would be seen as instigating revolution. And they completely censored the play. I mean, you cannot do this play. Eventually, after much turmoil, I wrote another play where I presented the revolution visually. So it was not on the text. They liked the text clean without the words, as you did when you were talking about your censorship issues. It's like, it's not there, I will work with it visually. So I am aware of like being in between worlds and the post-colonial situation. But these are the only people who trust my process and would work with me. And these are the conditions. And sometimes I say, no, I just hide in my farm and I just continue to be a farmer and forget about theater. But there are so many stories I want to tell. So I am in that constant conversation and negotiating what do I give up to in order to be able to do the work. And coincidentally, my second play was about that. The conversation between the playwright and the director, both are me in reality. The show must go on, but how about the authenticity and the integrity of the play? Do you want the play to be shown at all? Some of the play or nothing at all? So it's, unfortunately, censorship in many different ways, some financial and some political, but we still want to work and the show must go on, so what can we do to present what we want to do and our real stories within the current circumstances?
Yeah, I can give an example also from a theater practitioner in Lebanon who works with drama therapy, and that would, speak about how these traditional, like the storytelling tradition, for instance, the Arabic storytelling tradition, how it is really played within the contemporary theater. And it would also speak about which I totally agree with, how we live today in really hybrid cultures, and especially in the theater. The theater culture, I think, is very hybrid. Zena Dakash, a drama therapist, like her two famous plays in Lebanon, took place in prison settings. So she worked with the men's prison and the women's prison. When she did the play with the men's prisons, she used as a device the play 12 Angry Men, and she made it into 12 Angry Lebanese. That was the essence of the play. But when she worked with the women's prison, the device that she used was the Shahrazad storytelling. So the play was called Shahrazad and Ba'abda, Shahrazad and the prison of Ba'abda. And they both spoke perfectly with the audiences, and the first play led to a change in a Lebanese law. It led to actually enforcing a law that was, passed but was never enforced about, prison statements. So these things happen all the time, but honestly, sometimes you do it unconsciously, it's part of your repertoire also and baggage as a human being to begin with.
I just want to say something that's just so evident to me right now. And when I talk about economic censorship, and Dalia talks about the same sort of thing, but also actual censorship, I don't think any other culture, and maybe I'm making too blanket a statement, but if you think about it, we're all talking about how we can say things and get them heard. And I don't know if we were doing a Latin American or an African, that there would be this much pressure on Arabs, whether they're working in an American theater context or working in the Arab world, about dancing around, trying to get even a part of what you want to say heard. And it's striking to me that I'm not a big identities person. I think we all are multiple things. I think being a playwright is my identity more than because I chose it, more than anything else I've been born into. But I think we're all dancing around the same sort of thing, and I don't think any other culture has as much more, and I think it's connected to the politics of what's happening in the region. And what's happening in America, and how what's happening in America is affecting what's happening in the region. I can't think of any other culture that would have both the artists within the Western context feeling economically censored, trying to dance around and get a portion of their humanity on stage, and also those working, and I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, I would say that, Dalia, I run the Center for American Studies at the American University of Beirut. And when I hear the word, when spreading culture, when you say spread, if you hear the word American and spreading in the same sentence, run for your life. That's, whatever they're spreading, you don't want to be spread, right?
Unless it's my place, then they want to spread them.
Yeah, you don't want to be spread. You don't want them spreading on you. But I think Betty said something that's really quite important. I think we acknowledge it in the case of African American literature, culture, theater, this cultural plurality. I know that, as I mentioned, Marvin's work on Ibn Daniel, which I was really intrigued with, and then recently wrote an article about how Ibn Daniel is the clear source of Rojas's Celestina. There's absolutely no doubt, but to put that together, and this is, Rojas's Celestina, many people would put it right up there with Quixote, one of the great sources of the modern European novel, theater, etc. Once you look, it's incredibly hard because it's oral traditions in the Iberian Peninsula. There's really no doubt. So this interpenetration, it's important when we talk about post-colonialism that we acknowledge, and as I was talking about yesterday, Menopau's work that makes it clear that without the Arabs in Spain, there's no Boccaccio, there's no Petrarch, there's no Chaucer, there's no Provençal poets, right? Everything, all of these things that are seen as the wellspring of Western literature. So you can think both things at the same time. And I think that, one reason that we work together so well is SAHAR sort of, the glasses half full in terms of practice. I can keep filling it up. And I'm saying, well, look at what's missing from the puzzle, whether it's Margaret Litman's work on Arab Hamlet or the new work that she's doing on Russian influence in the Arab world is that as soon as we confine our universe, what we do is create a dramaturgy which is reductionist. By its nature, it's reductionist. Clearly, through practice, you're trying to define Arab dramaturgy, but as you and Betty are saying, without some platform or trying to follow the money, what we do is have a little bit of money. We have a little bit of money, and within that, we can do whatever we can get away with the censor. Should I not say that? Yeah. Yes.
Maybe very short, we have to go to the next question, running out of time.
Well, yes, I want to just expand on that. My mind flashes back to our first conference on contemporary drama in Egypt, which I mentioned before, that Dalia helped to organize. And in the discussions which followed, and the discussions are in part reproduced in the proceedings, in the discussions which followed, censorship was the main concern. And I'm interested in how little things have changed in a sense. That is to say, we had a representative, which I think we don't have today, from the Egyptian Cultural Service in New York, who stood up and said, there is no censorship in Egypt, which I'm sure is what would be said today. And I'll just let that pass. But I would say that one of the responses, I think it was Lenin El-Romney's response, but maybe not, in any case was, well, there's censorship and censorship. That is, even if there is not state censorship, there's economic censorship, which everybody in the United States must understand. It is naive to say, oh, there is no censorship in the United States. You can do anything you want. Well, obviously you can. And to some extent, there is economic censorship everywhere. In addition to political censorship, there. And again, this is not a question of overt saying you can't say that, but it is a question of, especially theater's especially vulnerable because it is a certain amount of material supports necessary just to put the thing out there. And so I just want to remark that it does strike me that these concerns, and even the terms of these concerns, have not in fact changed a great deal in 20 years.
One last question, and then...
Yeah, I was curious to ask, I'm curious about what in Lebanon as well, but I know in Egypt there's the popular theater, comedies, and then there's the experimental underground. Is there anything in between, or is it just popular comedies, and then there's this wide gap, and you get to sort of the experimental theater where, you know, crowd shot for that, and are there any bridges? Is that, and I'm curious if that's the same in
the Egyptian formula has a lot of categories. Some of them are the government-run theaters, so there is the Thaqafa Kamahiriya, the cultural palaces, the cultural clubs, and each of them has their own like clubs and competitions and festivals, and the public theater, which is like 14 theaters in Cairo, 2 in Alexandria, the independents and the experimental. And the independents have been having harder time in Egypt, but many of them have access to other places. So Laila Sulaiman showing her work in Europe, Ahmed Al-Attar opening his plays abroad first and then in Cairo. What happened in the last few years, which is not something I'm very happy about, is something called Masrah Masr, Egypt Theater, and it's a weekly televised play that many people think this is theater, because very few people go to the theater. Cairo has 22 million people, has 14 stages, 4 of them are closed. So very few people are theater goers. I mean, I go to the theater and I'm shaking hands with everybody as if it's a funeral. I mean, I know most of the audience in many of the smaller plays. So Masrah Masr becomes the theater and defines the theater. And many of the young ones who have never been to a live performance see this as theater, and it's mainly bad vaudeville slapstick comedy making fun of people's like weight or height or skin color or whatever, but it's the weekly dose, and another model was based on it, so now there are 2 or 3 of these that are televised. They do one play a week, and they show it, and they don't even bother to write it. So it's a new addition, but it's not a very healthy one, I have to say.
Yeah, I think in Lebanon, and Robert can also speak about that, I think there's a range of things happening. You have, on one side, the social comedies, very commercial, you know, successful in terms of box office social comedies. You have device theater that, you know, companies like Zuhaf are doing, or, you know, Collective Kahraba, they work with puppetry and masks. You know, we're doing, you know, we did, the last of our work was Blood Wedding, but we've done a variety of different things. So it's very eclectic in a way, like people are working with verbatim documentary techniques, you know, translation happens a lot because, yeah, if a text that's already tested, you know, and it can sell and it can speak to people and people will be interested in it. But some of the last plays I've watched in Lebanon, you know, has to do with, like, one of them was very also successful in terms of box office, was called Hacker Shay, like Talk of the Men or something like that, like interviews based on interviews with men. But also different forms of theater is really very, you know, prospering in Lebanon. Playback theater, drama therapy, improvisational theater, puppetry, you know, all sorts of things really. And Beirut is a very small city with, right now we have maybe 5 theaters like Medina, Sunflower, Mono, Babel just closed down last year, and Zuhaf opened their studio, and the rest are really alternative spaces. But yeah, I think it's not one thing that's happening, but 2 things, like extremes.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We've come to the end of our time now. I really would very much like to thank Bethy, Sama, Robert, Dalia, our wonderful panelists, for this variety of perspectives and alternatives for dramaturgy. And beginning a round of applause, please. Thank you.